You are live.
Great. As the chair of this organizational of this work group, I'll call this meeting to order for the sake of attendance. So it looks like everyone is in attendance, which is great. So nice to see all of you. Everybody came back for the second meeting. That's a good sign. See things go. And you know, in sort of putting together the agenda and talking with Regina and the team, I think really our initial thought was really just to dig into all the different documents that Eileen had put together, you know, on behalf of the group, and sort of like, you know, and be able to sort of ask questions about them. So I hope you've had a little bit of time to sort of think about them, but you know, just to really sort of dig into sort of all the steps that have happened over the last few years to sort of get us to this point, and then we can sort of figure out, you know, sort of a conversation and questions where to go from there, and sort of how we figure out sort of our next few meetings and what sort of the agenda should look like. So with that, Eileen, if you're comfortable in sort of the four documents you put together and shared with us, that I know they'll be able to sort of make as part of the official agenda and make public, but you know, it'd probably be helpful, I think, probably just to sort of talk a little bit about them and sort of see if anyone has any questions to dig into it, if everyone can kind of hold it up.
Sure. I mean, one of the earlier election priorities came from the group in 2018, which consisted of myself, Arnold Smith, and Cliff Myers. And some of those were carryovers. Fortunately, some of them, such as office staffing and funding, had been taken care of, and a number of other types of things on that document. In fact, I probably could have sent you the update on it, because we did go through it with this current group to show what had been taken care of. The major document really is the one probably from the report that was given to the city council in the work session. And what that was done with the last group, which was myself, Brianna Cuffey, and then Rebecca Brenia. There was also some input from Cliff Myers, who had been on the board for 2.5 years. And so this was really an attempt to kind of look at the overall code and just say, this is what needs to be done. Didn't really try to come up with saying we should, you know, we recommend this or we recommend that. I think, you know, just going through it briefly, there was basically, you know, 3 parts to it. The preparations for the 2021 elections went well. We've used the Anne Arundel County Board of Elections for the past 2 elections, and I think the overall feeling is that they do a great job, and it benefited the elections in Annapolis. Prior to that time, the city of Annapolis had to run its own elections, and that entailed getting vendors, you know, doing recounts. As anybody can remember, the 2013 election, which was very stressful because there was a recount. So people have been pretty pleased with that. Saying that, there are some boundaries as far as what can be done if we want to continue that relationship. And I'm not saying yes or no, but it is something to be aware of as we move forward. Because if the municipal elections changes or is very different from what the state does, they may say we can't do that. For instance, in towns that use nonpartisan elections, they run their own elections. And that's just a factor. It's not something, you know, I'm not saying it's an obstacle, but it's just a factor. The types of things that really kind of pop up, certainly since the last election, is deciding the recommendation for how to proceed. Mail-in ballots were generally very well received, but that's not what the current code calls for. That was done with a special resolution, and it was done mostly with COVID in mind. But to be honest, the board had been looking at moving to mail-in ballots before COVID. It just jump-started it. And overall, it worked out well. Again, the County Board of Elections ran that. The current Maryland code, if I have it correct, now allows for people to request a mail-in ballot to be sent to them automatically. That kind of does away with absentee ballots, not not entirely. A lot of people were confused about what an absentee ballot was versus a mail-in ballot. Both of them were considered vote by mail opportunities. And in any case, you can still vote in person, but that's certainly something that ideally before the next election would be, a recommendation would be made for that. And I say that because when we're looking at all of these things and we're looking at making legislative changes, ideally it might be great to have the entire thing forth, but that may be unrealistic. And we may be looking at some of the things that are being recommended may not be on the books or be able to be implemented until the 2029 election. So that's something to keep in mind. But anyway, that's one thing. And, you know, another thing I'm just looking at what I sent out and some of the types of things. Going with a mail-in ballot has certainly things that would change and just automatically change. I think the biggest thing in looking at the code is that there's just a lot of ambiguity and vagueness. For instance, one example is like, for instance, recounts. In the last election, we had a recount. It tells us we have to have a recount. It tells you when you have to have a recount, but it doesn't tell you how to do the recount. I mean, it doesn't, you know, tell you, it tells you to go to the court and file for it. And, you know, the person that asked for the recount went to the court and they didn't know how to do it either. So that's an example of maybe looking at state code and for input. You know, any other types of things? When we look at the moving forward, like I said, priorities are to decide to look at partisan versus nonpartisan. That's been coming up for a while. And I think that has to do with really what's going on with the council. One of the pieces that come up with that is the Hatch Act. And there's been various views in terms of how that affects such a an election. The election cycle is again something that comes up perennially. Both of those items, if you looked at the Charter Revision Commission, what the Charter Revision Commission decided to do, which I was on, was rather than say, again, yes, you need to do this, our recommendation is do it, they decided to maybe put it in the form of a referendum. And that was their recommendation. If you're not comfortable making that, if the city council is not comfortable making that decision, then ask the voters. So that would be something. But then again, our referendum policy and procedures are not very well outlined either.
That's something that needs to be reformed too, probably, right?
Right. Determining the election cycle, that's another thing that has come up a lot. I think actually, and this is just my personal opinion, but also as a board member, I think one of our priorities, which I would like to see if possible put in place before the next election, is looking at the fair election policies. The fair elections reform in that entire area would be one big jump. We have gotten information, or we have been prodded a little bit from the state board of saying, you really need to look at this. You need to be more specific. We found in the last election, social media has made a big impact, and how we monitor and how we determine what is a campaign expense, what is just a personal expense, how people communicate, how candidates communicate on social media. That's just something that really needs to be looked at. And I think that would be a priority. We end up having to do a lot of policing and really didn't have anything in code in which to refer to. And then
that's kind of interesting. Can you talk a little bit about that? What the experience was in the last cycle of what policing looked like from your position and trying to.
Well, we would get complaints both from voters and from other candidates saying candidate Smith is promoting their candidacy on their Facebook page. Is that allowed? Well, is it a personal Facebook page, or is it, it all has to do with the tagline in terms of who is doing it. We also, in this election cycle, had candidates that were using Act Blue and using other means by which to get monies. And so that was new for us. That's very new. But it's not just, Facebook, it's Twitter, it's all the social media that's going out there. And so to have some guidelines as far as that. Also, in terms of fair election reform, we had some candidates that there's always kind of some tension between, for instance, if there's an incumbent. So if an incumbent is involved with, say, a community picnic, and they're running for office, is that a campaign? Should that be reported as a campaign, or is that within their their purview as the representative for that area? Again, we don't have information, so that is from the Board of Supervisors standpoint, we can't enforce things. So having guidelines would be helpful. I mean, we don't want to make them too strict. I mean, people complain about, they gave something away. Well, technically, if you're going to make it that strict, you can't give your campaign workers anything like a t-shirt. I mean, that would be considered a gift. So what is a gift? Also, what is an appropriate campaign expense? We've been wrestling with that. For instance, is membership in a local organization a campaign expense? Is giving $500 to the Boys and Girls Club a campaign expense? Again, it's campaign versus, just a regular expense. So guidelines there would be really helpful. Jared D. Moranis, who is in charge at the Maryland level, is more than willing to come meet with you all and could give you a much better idea. He's been working in that office for quite a while. He's been a great resource to the board. For instance, one of the things that is new in the code is the section on independent expenditures, which had been something the state had been asking the city to do for a while. It's very extensive. Nobody really wants to make the code super extensive, but if you look at that part of the code, it's a good example of how you have to tie in things like social media and what's new and what's going on in elections today.
Before we dig into that, I think Scott has a question.
I'm sure.
I did. The comment about Boys and Girls Club, that example of giving a contribution to Boys and Girls Club raises for me a question of our obligation is to follow state law. The city code can be stricter or provide more detail than state law, but at a minimum, we have to comply with state law, correct? This isn't considered original jurisdiction.
Don't quote me, but I believe it is. You go by municipal code first, unless it's in direct violation of state code. So you can follow it. It's just you make your own rules. You don't have to go by the state all the time.
That may be something worth exploring, because I think the default is state code unless the city speaks to it.
We've had problems where we don't have information. And so when we've gone to the state and looked at what their code is, we pretty much have to make it ours, or at least vote on it in that regard. So they have much more detail than we do. For instance, in fair election laws, we have very little in terms of enforcement. I mean, we still have an outstanding campaign report from July that hasn't been fully completed. I mean, that type of thing. Enforcement is also another thing that you'll hear Jared talk about. If we get people that just flat out don't do things. We looked into, Cliff Myers really led the charge on looking at fair election reform in terms of trying to look at it in terms of technology. The state has a system which, when you as a candidate put in your campaign information, will tell you right away, not allowed, or you're late on this or whatever, and they automatically generate letters. It's a great system. It's really interesting. We looked into trying to do it for the state, and the vendor said $300,000, and that doesn't include updates.
Interesting. Faye has a question.
I had two questions. So the first question is the legal questions. Is that something that we could bring the city attorney in to address those for us to make sure
Sure.
that we're on firm
And
ground?
I can double check with Ashley. Ashley Leonard is actually the liaison for the Board of Elections. And I can even ask that question for you all and send out his answer. Unless you want to have,
I mean, there may
but-
be some other legal questions, so as long as we know we have a contact there that we can refer to make
yes,
sure.
and Ashley is very familiar with the election code. And she has done any drafting that we've had to do, like for independent expenditures or any other changes that we've had to make.
And the other question, the priorities document, you said you had some updates, but the priorities document had 2018. And as we know, things have changed a lot since 2018. So are we going to get an updated priorities document from the board?
Right, you have one from 2018, you have one from 2022. I believe that at our next meeting, the current board will be discussing some additional priorities. Again, I think the board struggles with wanting to make recommendations, but really wants to just say, these are the areas that you need to look at and kind of keep it open to that. And there's also, again, some limitations that we have in terms of what we can and cannot do, at least currently. But yes, to answer your question, yes, there'll be something coming.
Thank you. And I'm sort of keeping a list of people that, topics and people maybe for future meetings. So Ashley, I think would be great we should probably reach out to her and ask her just to come in and talk about.
One of the things.
Actually, but before you go,
Mhm.
Andrew has a question.
First of all, thanks for putting together that document, incredibly useful and comprehensive. I just wanted to touch on one of the things that you said earlier. So it sounds like working with the County Board of Election was pretty much an unmitigated success if I'm reading the document correctly. But you mentioned that it might constrain what we're able to do in terms of changes when it comes to not for instance, having a nonpartisan primary or something like that. Is that something that they just don't have the capacity to do, the will to do? Could you touch on a little bit more where the tension is there with using the county, but also limiting the flexibility?
And it really has to do with what their mission is. So if they're running elections, for instance, that is, say, I'll use a different example, a closed primary, meaning Republicans can vote for Republicans, Democrats can vote for Democrats. And say a municipality says, we want an open primary. That may be something they say, within our mission, we can execute that for you. Or they may say, no, the state does not run open primary. So in that case, that is not something that we would be willing to take on. Because the way we functioned with the county was we have a memorandum of understanding. So it's kind of what they will do, what we will do, and any costs that are involved in that. So it really has more to do with that. So I don't want to speak for them to say, no, they won't do it. But when we've talked to them in the past, there are certain things they're going to say, well, we could probably do that, but we might not be able to do this. Another factor that has come in with working with the county has been that the cost is low. They do not, for their services, directly charge the city, which is a pretty big savings of probably somewhere around $150,000. The city is still responsible for the costs incurred for things like printing ballots, mail, that sort of thing. So the election still runs. I can't remember what the last one ran, but it is a significant. It is significant for the county to be able to do that for us. Now, the reality of that is, I'm sure it has to do with whoever is sitting in the county executive seat. And so for the past two administrations, one which was a Republican administration, and one which was a Democratic administration, that helped pave the way for that. So I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Yeah, it does. I think it sounds like something that we'll need to like work with them to, once we know exactly kind of what we have in mind, present that and see what their reaction is.
And again, I don't view them as an obstacle, but I do view it as a factor.
Hmm.
And again, there are many municipalities that choose to just run their own elections. And so that gives them a little bit more leeway.
Great. And I just wanted to make a quick comment building on Faye's point. So like when it comes to identifying the priorities, I think we take what the board has and we use that as sort of a foundation. And then I think we are also, in the position to identify like what we see as priorities. And then we should also think about at some point, like soliciting input and comment from, the public, what they see as ways like we can improve that. So it's just a general comment, which I think most people probably were already thinking.
Right. And I think that would be great. I mean, one of the things that I've been disappointed with, or I shouldn't put it disappointed, I'll put it positive. I wish we saw more in terms of voters being engaged. All of the meetings for the Board of Elections are open meetings. Now, when we were met in person, it was rare that anybody attended our meetings. I think in some ways being it online is helpful because people can view it afterwards, but it is really important to get that feedback. And it would be great to be able to engage people to find out what they're thinking, what are the priorities for them. One of the things that has come up, but it's not, I'm sorry.
Scott has a question just on that point before we move on.
It's a comment, so I can hold it.
No, that's fine.
That's okay.
Yeah,
No,
feel free to
just
jump in.
Following off of what Andrew said about priorities and thinking about something that Eileen said earlier, one of the things that might be worthwhile to do is think about the subject areas that are perhaps more time sensitive than others. So ones that affect the way people file for running and then how the election is actually run probably need to be dealt with sooner than some of the administrative things around campaign finance, which could change a little more fluidly. So I would almost suggest that one of the things that has to be tackled first is a focus on, and I don't want to say partisan versus nonpartisan because I don't think it's a binary choice, but how we structure elections, because we could even suggest I think California calls it a people nominated system, where they have basically an open primary, but not in the sense of independents and unaffiliated voters can choose to vote in either party's primary, but where it really is an open ballot. I think people list their party preference, but don't have to be officially associated with a party. And then it's the top two that move on to a general election. That's probably more explanation than I needed to make at this point. But my point being, I think some of the topics are much more time sensitive because if the council is going to act on them, they need to act sooner rather than later. So maybe we should start looking at the list of subjects and saying, which are the ones that really out of that kind of necessity need to be tackled first.
And that kind of goes along with what I was saying as far as what can be done sooner for the next election as opposed to that can wait.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's right. Like, I mean, especially with what you were just saying about sort of the county. I mean, it doesn't seem to be there's any world where we're talking about bringing the running of the elections back into the city, right? So the question is, if the county is the partner in doing this, what does it do if you change from partisan to nonpartisan, or you say you want to move off onto the a different cycle? Like in some ways, we sort of need them to bless whatever we would do, right? So in some ways, like I think that having that conversation sooner rather than later about the big topics that would shape it, but also with them, because really it seems like
there's other factors that play into them, and you may want to ask David Garris, who is the director. Joe Torre had been the director for a number of years, and Dave is the new director. He'd been the assistant for a long time. David is very involved with elections on a broader scale and can also bring some information as far as other things to consider. I mean, in many of the last elections, things like recruiting election judges is a big thing. It doesn't sound like it, it's not something that's immediate, but it is something that's out there when you start looking at the code. David is aware that we're having this task force. I would encourage, he might be a good person to invite to a meeting and just say, what's going on at the state level? What do you think you would see it municipals. He also has a broader range in terms of knowing what's going on in other counties. I know we have someone on the board here familiar with Carroll County, which is great, but he would be able to kind of look at a bigger thing, also to see what else is in the future. I mean, people talked about mail-in for a long time, but it wasn't until COVID till it really got going. So what's the next step? I mean, there are people that are talking about online voting. So yeah, so that's out there. Just one thing, and I won't go on much longer, it can take more questions. One thing that isn't on here specifically, and I know that has come up, is talking about voter access. And voter access, at least while I've been on the board, and I expect it to continue, is run by the registration. Voter registration is run by the county. The city does not do its own voter registration. And so that's just something that, for instance, there have been requests for things like same day registration. And the question has been, okay, is that something that is needed? What is the cost involved in that? I forget which election it was. I did go back and look. And in a presidential election, I think in the last presidential election for the city of Annapolis, there were maybe 5 people asked for same day registration. So looking at things like how can we increase voter registration? Do we use things like same day registration? Do we do early voting? Do we do some other things? Again, it needs to be looked at, but I think in terms of trends and see if there's something better that could be done. But again, that's going to be through the Anne Arundel. Early voting, again, increases days for people, but and again, I'd have to look at the newer research. Does it increase turnout? So there's a difference between voter access and increasing turnout. And so that's something that you all might want to consider. The last election we hit, if we round it up, we hit 40% turnout, which we were quite happy with, considering it was an election where there were 5 uncontested seats and a non-competitive mayor's race. So we were pretty happy with 40% in COVID with that type of election, where in the past we were in the low 30s. So
was there a material difference in turnout amongst the wards? I mean, I'm just curious if the contested wards had much better turnout than the uncontested wards.
I'd have to look at the data. I don't know. We did ask the state if they could run a program letting us know if we were picking up new voters or we were picking up voters that were coming back. We were trying to get a sense of, were we reaching a population that historically we have not been able to reach in the past because of obstacles to getting to the polls. And unfortunately, we weren't able to get them to, I shouldn't say get them, that they chose not to, I shouldn't say chose, they declined to be able to do that.
JM?
Yeah, unsure if this was in the materials. I don't remember seeing it, but the policy for last election, it was all mail-in, right?
It was mail-in and in person.
Okay. Yeah, you have to have an in-person area, but was it a vote center, or were there separate precincts open?
It was separate precincts. Historically, Annapolis, in the past 3 elections at least, have tried to have 2 polling areas in each ward. In the last election, we reduced it to 1, and that was partly because we were going to mail in, and it was also partly because
Election judges.
It was partly that, but it was actually more so polling places. After 2013,
Getting in place, yeah.
The city can't hold elections in the schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to have separate polling places, and we were really making a great effort.
So we're
consistent.
so were ballots sent by mail to people who requested, or were they just sent to everyone?
They were sent to everyone. And they were sent to everyone because the time between the primary election and the general election, there wasn't enough time to process requests. So now at the state level, what we're doing is like in the last election, if you can request it every time where you'll get a mail-in ballot. Or if you want to do it each election, what you would do is you would request
To be on the permanent
essentially an
absentee. Yeah.
ballot, right? So you would request
You're
an
speaking my
absentee
language.
ballot, then you get, so you have to request the application,
Mhm.
and then the application comes back to you. You fill out the application, then you send in that, and then you get your mail. So there's like 4 mailings involved.
So they've actually kind of streamlined it recently. There's a permanent mail-in option that you can just go onto the state website and sign up, and you just say, hey, you know, it's in the same system as
Right.
you know, voter registration. Just make me a permanent, you know, absentee voter. Send it by mail, or send it via web so I can print it out and send it back, or send it via web so I can print it out and send it back via fax. It's
Right.
one of the things I was really wondering was when you sent all those ballots out, people would get them, and then they would still go to vote in person. Wouldn't that generate a significant amount of provisional ballots? I mean, wouldn't everyone then be a provisional ballot?
No, because the poll books were updated. So you have poll books. So when someone came to the polls
Mm-hmm.
and say, you know, Mrs. Smith came and she didn't remember, or she wasn't sure if her mail-in ballot was submitted, if she
Okay.
mailed it. And then the poll worker would take that name and look at it and say, yes, there has been a ballot that has already been processed, has been received. So
Mhm.
they would be told, you know, there's no need for you to vote again. If someone persisted and said, I want to vote, they would be given a provisional ballot. No one is told they can't vote.
No, of course not.
And in this last election, there was one incident of that. If you went, and one of the challenges we had, and this had to do with the state and it had to do with the technology involved, was there was a gap. There was originally going to be a 10-day gap between uploading names up to the state system for the poll books. Okay. Does
Mhm.
everybody know what a poll book is?
Yeah.
Okay.
They're actually replacing them in the next couple years. So
Right. So they were originally going to have like a 10-day. So it'd be like the election was on, say, you know, November 10th, let's say easier. So they were going to close updating the poll books on November 1st. And we were all like, that meant anybody that sent their mail-in ballots during that 10-day period, it would not show up in the poll books, which would make it more difficult because then you'd have more people who sent it in at the last minute who might show up and say, you know, you can't tell me
Right.
you got my ballot, so I'm going to vote again. We were able to reduce that to 4 days. Again, that is another situation where we're a municipality, depending on what the state can and cannot do for us, or will not do for us, because that's an expense probably to them for different programs. Now, it was in the news, we did have double votes. And that had to do with the upload on October 19th up to the state, that for some reason we had 4 people who had mailed in ballots and it wasn't in the poll books. And when they went to the polls, it showed that they hadn't voted.
yeah, the way the state deals with it is as soon as your ballot is generated, you're assigned a ballot ID. And if you go to the poll books, they'll say you have already had a ballot sent to you,
Right.
and then you have to vote provisionally. You have to vote provisionally.
Right, we didn't do it that way because everybody got a ballot.
Yeah, I
So-
can
so
see
there's
why that
some-
would be a problem.
Right, so we never found out why some names did not get uploaded into the state system. There is a follow-up backup system that identified those 4 people. And so we were able to investigate them. One was a married couple. All 4 of them were elderly people and had submitted their ballots correctly and then just weren't sure. And so there was a backup system to catch it, but it was still something saying, wait a minute, we got to look at this. And again, that was through the county. But again, it illustrates how challenging it is, to run an election. And if you're not using the county, you're going to be using vendors.
You're telling me.
Scott, feel free to jump in. I saw you had your hand up.
So the scenario you gave, we received the person's mail-in ballot and then they showed up to vote. They would be given a provisional until that could be worked out. Which ballot supersedes which? Is it the last ballot counted or the first ballot received? So if somebody, which becomes
In the state of
provisional?
Maryland, it's the mail-in ballot that is received, unless the mail-in ballot wasn't received and was somehow delayed and showed up like 3 months later, which has happened. In which case the provisional ballot is the one that counts.
Right. So a ballot like that, all provisional ballots are looked at specifically in the canvas. So if you had someone who had mailed in a ballot and then had a provisional ballot, both ballots would have come to the Board of Elections at the canvas, and then the decision would have been made. And I just don't remember. I believe that the first one in is the one that was counted. So if you mailed a ballot, it had to be in the possession of the Board of Elections by the start of the canvas. So that was the following week. And as you said, they can come in later, but if they come in after that date, they're not counted. So if you had somebody that had a provisional ballot and their mail-in ballot had not been received yet, you would go with the provisional ballot, because that's the one that was received.
Correct.
Does that make sense? So it's going to be different with how the state does it. Again, the state allows for you to download a ballot and return that. That's not something we've done for the city of Annapolis. And it's not something that maybe the state would say, okay, we'll be able to let you do it that way. Again, it comes back into what we can and cannot do. What we might want to do, can we do it through the County Board of Elections, or are we going to have to run the elections by ourselves? And that's why I listed some of the other towns that do run their own elections, such as Tacoma Park. I believe Salisbury might do it now. And they also have election staff to be doing that.
Keep in mind also, some of these problems go away if they take the recommendation and put it on the presidential year. I mean, then we just put our races on our ballots, which makes the ballot a lot longer.
Mm-hmm.
Might even bump it up to 2 pages, but yeah, a lot of the problems just go away if that happens.
Absolutely. But it's syncing it in with the cycle, and that is one of the things in the priorities, has been recommended. The scuttlebutt I hear is that in the past, and I don't know if it's with the future, the city council then feels like they're stuck. Do they give themselves an extra year? Do they cut themselves by a year? That can be handled legislatively. There's some kinks to work out with that. Again, that was discussed at the Charter Revision Commission also, in terms of saying you need to think about that. I believe the discussion with that was that going with the presidential might be better than going with what when we have county elections, because the thought was that having names both county and city at the same time could be confusing to the voter. So
Yeah, I'm sorry.
that's
I think there could be pros and cons with it. I mean,
Right.
it may be there and it takes away some of the issues, but then it creates other issues. As James said, the ballot will be longer. The city candidates would be on a down ballot. And so people may not look at that. So they may lose some of the support from that perspective. And then as far as the campaign, so you may not be able to focus on those issues that are relevant just to that city, but you want people to focus on their local because, politics happen at the local level. And so I think, there are pros and cons to doing it that way.
Right.
I know we're not talking about recommendations at this point, but I personally like to leave it as is and just have it by itself. But
Well, and I think that's,
for
look,
another time.
right. Well, I think that's, what we're asking the task force to really look at it from a different perspective and a more global perspective. We talk about there's pros and cons, but historically we haven't necessarily been able to list them completely so that people can say, people can say, okay, we think it edges this way. But he is right. It would make it a lot more, if you're looking at, you almost have to look at it from, are we looking at it from what's best for voters or what's best for candidates? And that's something that we've wrestled with in the past too. And so the board has always tried to err on the side of the voter, but you'll find that many things, it's the candidates that would say, we'd like it this way. You would probably get higher turnout if you synced it in with the regular election.
If you're on the presidential ballot, you would definitely get higher turnout. But the question is, right? Like, I mean, I was on the council the last time this was considered 10 years ago now, I think probably, but right. Like, and there was as Faye said, right, there's pluses and minuses in each of the things. And I think, right, like the view was not so much, I think that, from the people in that the issues that matter in the city that are animating the race would be drowned out because no one's paying attention to what's happening at the local level when it's in a presidential year or in the, a gubernatorial year. So like there's a legitimate argument, but I also think, as Jan was saying, like in a world where sort of, where the state is headed, it would answer a lot of these questions we have about trying to sort of do something that is sort of off on the side. It would be much cleaner, right? If you were sort of operating.
Right, and there's constraints then too, because you'll have to follow state more so than.
Yeah, you'll basically give up any sort of ability to have sort of a local flavor, local nuance.
Going back to, I think, Scott, I think you asked about voting centers. And I know that somebody asked about voting centers. I believe that at the state level, they're encouraging voter centers again.
Sorry. We
I know
recently just had to fight off a House bill where they were trying to return us to the levels of 2018, the amount of precincts districts that we had.
Mhm.
Some places just can't do it because we don't have the judges, we don't have the facilities to go back to that number right now, especially with the amount of people that are, using mail-in ballots. We would literally have precincts where 2 people walked in all day. But yeah, don't use the word vote center in the state, in anywhere in Annapolis, like in the Senate or the House, that it'll cause a fight.
Right. Well, I mean, we kind of have, resisted that in the past. Moving from 2 centers to 1 center, we didn't see any changes. We didn't have lines or difficulties. We did work really hard to actually map out the mass transit system to overlay to make sure that the ones that were picked.
Did you have any complaints about access?
We didn't
Okay.
have complaints about access. I mean, we're talking about 24,000 registered voters.
Yeah.
Across eight wards. We were pretty happy with it. Now, granted, mail-in ballots made a difference in that, but one of the things we really felt was necessary was consistency. It's very, very difficult for voters. Voters get confused because their voting place for all their other elections is different than what it is for the city.
Yeah.
We also wanted to make sure that all of the places that we use had a history of being a polling place. And the 8 that we have consistently been polling places, appear to be good polling places for the future. Whereas we had some others, some churches that would say, okay, well, we did it last year, but we can't do it this year. Maybe we'll do it next year. And we were really trying to avoid that. We also wanted to have places in terms of polling that had access to cameras, so that if we did have mail-in ballots with drop boxes, that they would have cameras that were already in place as opposed to having to rent cameras.
It would be interesting to see, I don't know if you have any stats, but you mentioned something earlier about you didn't, with the voter turnout, if they were new voters or returning voters. So it'd be interesting if we had the stats, when we reduced the number of polling places, voting centers to one, to one per ward, if the number of returning voters, I guess, decreased, or, was the voter turnout 40% because of new voters or because of returning voters, or just to see what the stats are and to make the comparison to see if
and
it did
we
make
asked,
a difference.
we asked for that information and weren't able to get it. I think it was just important for us also historically to make sure, again, it was consistent polling places. We also looked back at how many voters were in different voting places. And there was one, I can't remember which ward it was, but they had historically had maybe 92 people vote there. And the second, it was two churches that you could walk between. So, could those 92 people just as easily go to the other? It wasn't, we really didn't feel like going down to one was creating obstacles. And again, they were all consistent. They were all on major transportation lines. And for some people, they go to a wrong polling place. So if you live in Ward 1 and you work in Ward 6 and you went to Ward 6, they would say to you, you can either go back to Ward 1 and vote there, or you can vote here in Ward 6 provisionally, but you'd only be able to vote for the mayor. You couldn't vote for your ward. Whereas in a voting center, if you have a voting center, say we said Pitt Moyer was going to be the voting center for all of Annapolis. When you showed up at Pitt Moyer, you would say, I'm from Ward 3. And
You'd
they
have
would
all the
hand
ballot
you a
styles.
Ward 3 ballot style. And so everybody, but there's some challenges with that too, and making sure people get the right ballot. But that's what a voting center would look like, is having everybody go to a place like Pitt Moyer. We did have, there are two precincts. And so in the last polling, when we did go from two, that was another, well, there's two precincts in each ward. And so people were concerned that the precincts would get confused, and it didn't make a difference because they were getting the same ballot, whether they were in precinct 601 or they were in precinct 602. They got the same ballot. The question was making sure that they went to, the right polling place for Ward 6. So the board was generally happy with how things went. We didn't get complaints. Any other questions?
Great. And is there anything sort of, if you just want to sort of touch on some of the other documents, I know one is sort of the much bigger reports, but I think it'd be helpful just to, and sort of the list of resources.
Let me look at, I pulled that
Charter
up.
Review Commission, that's right. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, the Charter Revision Commission, one of the things was to expand the Board of Supervisors of Elections, and that was, of all the Charter Commission recommendations, that was the only one that's made it to the City Council. And the Board of Supervisors of Elections asked for it to be postponed because board's not opposed to expanding it. It's just, they didn't put in place the mechanism for doing so. So right now, the code reads, so you have to have there's 3 members. You have to have 2 members of the majority parties. And then the third member could be of either majority party. So historically, if there's a Republican mayor, there's going to be 2 Republicans and a Democrat. With the Democratic mayor, it's going to be 2 Dems and 1 Republican. But if you expand to 5, the thought was making an effort to include unaffiliated. voters, which comprise about a third of the registered voters in the city of Annapolis. So again, are you talking about how do you split that up if that's the way you want to go? So that was why it was postponed. That again would be something that maybe you all could look at and come up with a recommendation. How you do that? How do you include unaffiliated? Or somebody from the Green Party, you know, so that's why that was put on hold. There was another thing that didn't make it on the final recommendations. It really didn't get looked at in charter revision, which is an election issue, which is how to fill vacancies. And that has been somewhat controversial in the past. Whether you, if it's more than, if a member, if there's an opening with more than 15 months in the term, you have a special election. If it's under 15 months, then the central committees take care of that. So that was one of the, so that was there. So those were the two things that were actually in the charter, along with the nonpartisan versus partisan in the election cycle.
And then on that issue, the recommendation from was basically just to go to all special elections, no matter what time? Is that what-
They didn't go there.
Okay,
Ended up not going there. I mean, it was one of those things which are our priorities of our priorities. And so they didn't go there, but that was something that had been asked for them to consider as in the charter.
gotcha. Scott?
That's an interesting issue because it's one you kind of have to stack, because depending upon how you form your elections, it really narrows your choices on whether or not central committees matter, which limits a little bit further because it could be a city council appointment. But one of the things I wanted to flag for us for later when we look at special elections, it's a tiny issue, but administratively, if there's a special election in a ward, all candidates in all wards or all open accounts in all wards have special reporting requirements. And so we had a POP special election. This is back when I was treasurer for Alderman Payon, when he was treasurer. And all of a sudden, you know, had to rethink some vacation plans because Ward 2, while not being competed, had campaign finance requirements for reporting that popped up with little notice. So maybe an opportunity to limit the special reporting just to the ward that's being competed and allow others to sign an affidavit that they're not materially participating in the election.
Right. Again, that goes back to the structure.
Yeah.
You know, and the structure just triggers a lot of and different things. Some of that, again, it goes back to fair elections. You know, you could have someone in a special election, say in Ward 2. You're going to need somebody from Ward 5 to file theirs because they transferred money into that campaign.
I think the state has it's like an affidavit that you can fill out that says, if you're in a state election cycle, you're not going to materially participate in the federal election cycle, and then you don't get triggered for extra reports, if my memory is right from being a state campaign treasurer long ago.
Right.
But
And that would be helpful. One of the things, when I came on the board in 2000, so long ago, forget, 2014, all the campaign fund reports were done by an outside accounting firm. And the challenge we had was they were checking the math, but they weren't checking the code. And so when we were reviewing them, we're like, well, okay, but this is not consistent with code. And so they were paying at the time about $10,000. It's probably more like $15,000 now to this outside group. So now the board does it themselves. And it really can get onerous at times. And again, we don't have enforcement to force candidates. We can fine them if they're late. With the first one up to $250 in a non-election year. But we can't enforce, like if you say you need to submit an amended report in 30 days, well, if they don't submit it, you know, there's nothing to back that up. So that's kind of a tangent, but it is something that by tightening up, again, the fair election laws would give us a little bit more streamlining how we can do it and how we can enforce it. I mean, and then we get people that refuse to pay the late fee. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me as definitely, and to Scott's earlier point, right, sort of the ordering of the priorities and the scale of things, but like it does matter in that it strikes me like having been someone who was, for a lot of years, having those filled out, like the question is if, and I remember when I was on the council, there were, a few sort of more flagrant offenses by some of my colleagues, but like, like what enforcement teeth are there to do anything about that on behalf of the board? And that's
Right.
like,
I mean,
it's always been an issue, right?
right. And that has to go into kind of also just the running of the elections and what support you have. I mean, we got so many calls from everybody about election signs. That's like was the bane of our existence. You can only do so much with, I'm sorry, but the corner of Tyler Avenue and Bay Ridge is going to have everybody's there. Now that may change since they're building houses there and the property owners may be taking them. But, those are the sorts of things that is interesting. They're very time consuming, but those are the things that people really care about. We'll get questions. Can I take this sign off of my lawn? Yes, you can. Is it, or, people say, oh, the owner said I can put my campaign signs there. Well, I really don't think that, that shopping center owner said you could do that again, but that takes up a lot of time in terms of the actual day-to-day running of elections. We've actually had people that have asked us to reduce the sign, put a restriction on the size of signs that you can do for campaigns. And we deferred and just went to the city code, whatever the city code is for signs, that's what you can do. And you can do that. I mean, we do that. There are some cross areas, signs being one of them, where we defer to other sections of the city code. Another one is, I think, like you can't use city property for a campaign event. And then also in terms of employee, we did have a question like last time, there was a city employee that wanted to do a fundraiser for a candidate. So those are questions that come back. But again, we're looking for guidelines in the code for that. And sometimes we have them and sometimes we don't. So, if you want, I can pull up if you want me to look at some of the resources. What I try to do is, again, just give you the links for some of those election sites. The Maryland Municipal League is also one that would be helpful. Again, they're looking at the overall state to give you an idea of what the trends are. Like I mentioned to you, I don't think I included David Garris's information, but David Garris would be helpful to come in. And again, Jared D. Moranis would be helpful to come on and give their perspective in terms of what we can do and what they would like to maybe see. And especially David in terms of how they would like to see things. Oh, so here's an example actually that would answer your question, Scott, as far as whose code goes, who gets priority. We had a situation in the last election where someone had signed their name on a ballot. And that's like the whole, anonymity of a ballot is brought into question with that. And
Avoids the ballot.
well, we decided it didn't. And the county really was upset with us. And what the Board of Elections said was, we're going to consider it a stray mark because it's going to be destroyed. So so we had them duplicate it. So to give you background, during the canvass, if someone has like a stray mark or something's ripped on the original ballot, they bring it to the city. They bring it to the City Board of Elections. And then we'll usually say, make a duplicate. One thing we require or have asked is we want to see that second ballot the second time, and we want to see it destroyed before it goes into to be counted, to go into the scanner. We're not saying anybody's going to put two of them in there, but we want to see it. So we treated it that way. So we said, we're going to treat it as a stray mark, duplicate it, put the duplicated ballot through the scanner and destroy the original one.
You destroy the original one?
Well, it's not put out for, well, that's what I thought that's what they do with the, when you do I'm sorry, you're right, you void it. It's got a big
Right,
void all
right.
over. And so we also verified that if you had a recount, that ballot does not go on the recount because it's been voided. So in that case, the state law would have been different than what the city was. But they deferred to us, but they were surprised. It involves some communication. But again, the feeling was we wanted to make sure that every vote was counted. So.
Great, that's super helpful to sort of walk through that, Eileen, and any other sort of questions or thoughts on.
No, I mean, you could almost, but one of the things Regina and I kept saying we thought we should do or could do, and we still could do if you all were interested, is to actually go through the code and under each one make notes if you think that would be helpful. And we could say, for instance, under recount, you need to look at this. If you think that's would be helpful, we can do that. The other thing that might be helpful, Ashley Leonard in the past has looked at the state code and compared it with the city code and made comments on how they differ. And she's done that in the past, but the state code has changed. And that's why I sent you that summary guide, which was just in 2022. That could be a request maybe to ask her if she has the time. I know she's able to do it, but if she has the time to be able to do it, that would be helpful for you all to answer some of the questions on how things differ. As has been mentioned, I mean, there are some changes going on at the higher level in terms of Maryland elections, such as updating poll books. I did have the chance at one point, Brooke Learman is the new comptroller. The comptroller's office actually manages the computer systems for the state, including the Board of Elections. And I know that Sarah Elfrith was very involved, or not very involved, very interested in how the city can benefit from some of the technology at the state level. And so that's just some other people just to consider in terms of would be advocates, I think, if we wanted to try to go in that direction.
Thank you. Yeah, so I guess we're probably the next conversation really would be, and I think we sort of outlined some of these people we probably want to hear from next, right, as we sort of move along in this journey. But so I guess just to sort of sketch out my thinking based on this conversation would be, asking the David, right, from the county who oversees the election to come and talk with us about sort of how that relationship has worked over the last number of years and what potential things we might be thinking about and how they would react to that. Seems like a logical one that we would do sooner rather than later. Jared, from the state as well, if there's, sort of maybe building on that, probably the county first and then the state, just to sort of get our hands around sort of, things that could be proposed and how, if there's potential roadblocks to any of that, I think.
And in the case of the independent expenditures, what was done with that was Ashley reviewed the state and then tailored it to the city. So it looks very similar to the state, but it's tailored to the city. So it is different in that regard.
So, and my third thought would be Ashley, right? Like, and sort of be able to say, as someone on behalf of the Office of Law who does most of the election stuff and supports the board, like what, as we started this process, what should we be sort of aware of in that way? So I think, I guess I'm curious if anyone has any other thoughts, but it would strike me that those are probably the first three people we should try and see if we can get to come in and talk to us in the next meeting or two. Yeah, please, Andrew, hop in.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that makes complete sense. I would suggest maybe in parallel to that is that we think about like some sort of big picture goals that we want to drive at before we kind of identify like the solutions to some of the problems that we identify. I think it would be useful for like the group as a whole to kind of come coalesce around, like I said, 3, 4, 5 goals, whether it be increasing access, reducing barriers. I think Scott had an interesting one last time talking about like competitiveness, like increasing the competitiveness of elections, all those sorts of things. So, because once we identify the goals, there's probably like a dozen different possible solutions to any of them, right? And I worry if we go like direct to one potential solution for any one, we won't be considering all the possibilities and whatnot. So that would be point one. And then point two is we probably want to, if we are going to try to get citizen input here, we probably want to do that sooner than later. I don't know if it makes sense for us to like develop like a very short survey or send out some sort of form for public comment. But we probably want to work with the communications team to, I would say, get that going like, now or before the next meeting, or just really as soon as possible.
Thank you. No, I totally agree with that, Scott.
I would want to echo Andrew's point about focusing on goals, and I'd be willing to talk a little bit about some analysis on the competitiveness issue. I've definitely done some, and it could frame a conversation of what at least I see as a problem, and hope that you all might agree is a problem when all is done. But we could flesh out then whether or not it's a goal. And I also agree an open-ended kind of public input hearing that asks if there are challenges that people are seeing with the elections that they want addressed early, I think would be really helpful.
Thank you. Faye?
I also agree with Andrew that we should have goals. I think that maybe one way to approach it before the next meeting is for us individually to come up with what we think the areas are that we should look at and see where there are commonalities. And then maybe even send it to you as the chair in advance of the next meeting. And I also agree with the survey to get the public involved in to feel what the public concerns are.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and trying to sort of figure out how to use, one of these next sessions really almost as sort of like a work session, right, amongst ourselves to sort of dig into those goals. Eileen?
I can't find there's my raised hand. Right.
Yeah.
One of the things the Charter Revision Commission did was also go out to community groups. So I know a couple went to the community group in Parole. There's the Eastport one, Ward 1, and that's just another thought of going out to groups. And again, if there's 2 people, you're not a majority, so you can do that. And what they would do is then they would write up notes that they would share with the group. I mean, ideally, everything would be, taped and all of that, but that wasn't, an option at least before, and may or may not be an option now, but you may want to consider doing that also. And there is a list of community organizations on the website. I'll be honest with you, it's a bit dated. I did it for the Charter Revision Commission, have an updated list. But there's probably a good number of them that would respond. But again, I think sooner rather than later, because we ran into the same challenge over the summer and we didn't hear back, or they said, we're not meeting for the summer.
Sure.
That was another one, but there are some other community groups. Again, another one I'm thinking of is Bloomsbury Square, Eastport Community, and there are some HOAs that are out there too, but we haven't used. They didn't respond as much as some of the others did. So I can send you that as a resource too.
That's great. No, and I think everyone's points are well taken about getting the comms folks and with Regina, to figure out sort of what a public input thing in this context would look like, and sooner rather than later to sort of get that ball rolling. So I have a note to sort of follow up with them on that as well, and make sure we can do that, as well as sort of inviting some of these other folks. And Faye's idea, I think, is smart about sort of I'll do a follow-up email about and probably for our next session, and sort of that, asking everyone to sort of identify some thoughts on themes, and then we can use the time to really dig into it together.
And I would say, so it doesn't all fall on your shoulders, like feel free to like reach out to me, and I imagine other members are fine if like I can be helpful, you know, as between now and the next meeting.
No, that sounds great. I appreciate that. Yeah, and like, I mean, frankly, the city staff, Regina and her team and stuff, I think, will be really helpful in sort of guiding us to what we can do. But, from the public point of view, and I think Eileen's point is right. I mean, my hope is that there's multiple occasions we can do that, whether, when it would be an officially noticed session where you would sort of take input from folks in the community, but also really trying to figure out how to get out in the community as we get a little more handle on, sort of this is what we're doing and what's your input in specific groups. And I think that there's definitely a lot of value in those, in a lot of those community groups, and showing up and just saying, I'm here to, tell us what you think, right? So, some segment of us, and then be able to report back, I think.
And you can also drive people to the comment form on the website. And I don't know if you all had a chance to look at that. So you all do have one. I did want to ask Regina, there's two sections. One's called the Board of Elections Task Force and one's the task force. And that may be a little confusing. So that may be something to iron out. But I think you will get some comments. And you can also drive people to those comments too. Or to do to make those comments and then read them or put them in a Dropbox or something like that for sharing.
No, that sounds great. Yeah. So, and since Regina's not able to join us tonight, I'll use that sort of updating her on what we discussed as a way to sort of put some of this on paper, and then we can sort of follow up in there with sort of an email chain in advance of the next one. But I think that sounds great. Great. And anyone else have anything they want to
We have
bring
to
up or get into?
You have to
approve
do
the
your
minutes.
What's that?
We have to, we were both saying we have to approve the minutes. from the last
Yes. Okay. So of the first meeting of the task force, we have minutes that have been shared. Do we have a motion?
I move
Motion to
that.
approve the minutes.
I second it.
I'm sorry, who did the first? Oh, you got it, Scott. Okay.
So the minutes have been moved and seconded for approval. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Great. Thank you. Cool. Anyone else have anything for the good of the order before we ask for a motion?
You want to verify the next meeting? The date?
Let's see here.
So it's what, the 2nd and 4th, correct?
You all are scheduled for the 26th, Wednesday at 6 p.m.
26, okay.
And I'll send out the invitation after this meeting adjourns.
Perfect.
I will be on the West Coast on the 26th for work, so I'm going to verify whether or not I can attend, but I may have a conflict.
Okay. Yeah.
So if I can't attend, we'll need somebody to substitute to take minutes.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, right. I'm sure we will all be pulled in different directions at different points. So that's just sort of the nature of this kind of group, but thank you. Great. So if nothing else, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a
Second,
second? Great. Moving seconded to adjourn the meeting for the evening. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Great. Thank you, everybody.